Good afternoon, folks. I hope everybody is doing well. This is part 3 in my lecture series on animal nervous systems. So if you've not yet watched part 1 or part 2, you should probably go back and see those first so that you have the background you need going forward here. Also, if you are in my biology class, you should please go on my Blackboard site and get a copy of the notes for this section, which will have important vocabulary so that you can follow along. Now, in my last lesson, I dealt with some of the technicalities of animal nervous systems. We talked about animal senses, different kinds of sensory receptors, and sensory processing, and how and why some animals are better at certain senses than others. We dealt with information processing in the central nervous system and how information is sorted and filtered and decisions are made, and motor output, sending signals from the CNS out to various effectors. We finished up by taking a look at neurons and showing how they work, the parts of a neuron, and how they transmit signals from not only neuron to neuron, but also to muscles, glands, and other structures they are affecting. Now, lest you think that they're all that's going on, though, the nervous system actually contains a lot more cells than neurons, and I want to talk about those at least briefly. That your neurons are going to be only about 1 out of every 50 cells in the nervous system. Now, obviously, they are where the action happens. They are where the signals are being produced and transmitted and moved around. But there are a wide variety of supportive cells that help out in animal nervous systems as well. We call them neuroglial cells, Neuroglial, sometimes just glial cells, Glial for short. Neuroglial cells are, again, doing the support functions in the nervous system. There are 7 documented types of neuroglial cells. The handout that I put on Blackboard says that there are 6 because there's been a new one discovered since I made that handout. We do not yet know what it does or really much of anything about it yet. It exists, but I can't tell you more than that. So we're still finding new things in there. But there are 4 types of neuroglia found in the central nervous system and 2 types in the peripheral. In the peripheral nervous system, you've already heard about one of them, and that would be Schwann cells, capital SCHWANN, named after the great 19th century biologist Theodore Schwann. Schwann cells make up the myelin sheaths. Remember the myelin sheaths, MYELIN, or the myelination, as we sometimes call it. Sheath is SHEATH. Myelin sheaths form the insulation of nerve fibers. They are wrapped around nerve fibers in order to conduct the signal properly, make sure that it gets to where it needs to go, and basically acting like electrical insulation around a wire. By the way, if I didn't say this last time, what we call a nerve is really just a bundle of individual nerve fibers, and a nerve fiber is basically just an axon branching off from a neuron. So when you have a bunch of axons all bundled together, that makes up a nerve, and the axon can be called a nerve fiber. So yeah, the Schwann cells act as the myelination in the peripheral nervous system, providing insulation for nerves, so that signals don't ground out before they get where they need to go. The other type of neuroglial cell found in the peripheral nervous system is called satellite cells, so named because we find them around the outside of ganglia. Remember that ganglia are clusters of neuron cell bodies. Satellite cells are found on the outside of those ganglia, like satellites orbiting a planet. And we don't actually know what they do. Function of satellite cells is presently unknown. They're there. We find them in all animals with ganglia. We don't know why they're there. As you're probably gathering, there are a lot of mysteries still in the nervous system. It's a difficult system to investigate for a lot of technical reasons, most of which being that because it doesn't heal well, poking at a live human being to find out what happens when you poke at their nervous system has a lot of ethical issues. Doing so with an animal subject means the animal can't tell us what they're experiencing, and doing so on a corpse means that we can't find out what would happen physiologically. So, nervous system has been a little tricksy to investigate, and therefore it has more question marks in how it functions than most other parts of the animal body. Now, in the peripheral nervous system, there are 4 distinct types of neuroglia. First off, we have oligodendrocytes, OLIGODENDROCYTE, oligodendrocytes. Oligo means straight, dendro means branch, straight branch. Oligodendrocytes have a lot of straight processes branching off from them, kind of like the tentacles of an octopus. And what oligodendrocytes do is that they wrap their processes around nerve fibers in the brain and spinal cord. Oligodendrocytes basically do for the central nervous system what Schwann cells do for the peripheral nervous system. They form the myelin sheaths in the central nervous system. Incidentally, that's what we call white matter. White matter is a fatty tissue, folks. Basically, it's the phospholipid bilayer of the myelinating cells wound around the neurons. And as such, the myelin sheath is a very white fatty tissue, so that makes up what we call the white matter of the nervous system. The gray matter would be the unmyelinated parts, which we mostly find on the surface of the brain. Lacking myelination there is good, because in the absence of myelination there, the cells can more easily send signals to all the cells around them. It facilitates the communication of signals within the gray matter that does all the information processing. Whereas the white matter, we want to be directing the signals along specific tracts in the brain to exactly specific other parts of the brain that need that signal. So that needs myelination. Incidentally, the breakdown of oligodendrocytes is believed to be responsible for what we call multiple sclerosis, or MS, although we don't fully know why that happens yet. Also in the central nervous system, we are going to find astrocytes, A-S-T-R-O-C-Y-T-E, so named because astro means star. They have star-like processes extending from them. The astrocytes are going to form a very important barrier that we call the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is a defensive barrier, a sort of cellular filter found in the nervous systems of all vertebrates. The blood-brain barrier is going to prevent most chemicals in the bloodstream from getting into the tissue of the brain. It's a defensive barrier to protect the brain against blood-borne toxins and pathogens. Not many things get through. Mostly what gets into the brain is going to be electrolytes, oxygen, glucose, water, and a few other signaling molecules. Mostly what gets out are going to be nitrogenous wastes like urea and carbon dioxide. Not a lot of things other than that get in or out of the barrier, and that strongly protects the brain against outside pathogens or outside poisons that might be affecting other parts of the body. I think you can see why that's a special defense that's needed to make sure the body can coordinate its own response to dealing with any kind of threat. There are a few other things that can pass through the blood-brain barrier, I should point out. Certain drugs can. Nicotine, caffeine, alcohol, a number of our psychedelic drugs, LSD, psychotropics like THC, all those sort of things can get through the blood-brain barrier. Unfortunately, one thing that does not easily get through the blood-brain barrier is chemotherapy drugs, which is one reason why brain cancer is exceedingly hard to treat, because our brain treats most meds, unfortunately, as a toxin that would be filtered out, because toxin is pretty much defined by our body as molecule I don't make. And therefore, the blood-brain barrier sometimes poses obstacles to the treatment of brain problems. Any brain med or brain anesthetic or whatever we're trying to use has to bypass the blood-brain barrier, and that can take some careful chemical engineering to find a way to make that happen. We've recently developed a way of temporarily opening the blood-brain barrier with sound waves, but it's not really used for clinical application yet. It's still in safety testing stages. Also in the brain, we will find microglia, M-I-C-R-O-G-L-I-A. Microglia, despite the micro in their name, are macrophages. Remember macrophages from earlier bio classes? M-A-C-R-O-P-H-A-G-E-S, macrophages. Literally means big eaters. Macrophages are the cleanup crew of your body. They gobble up bacteria, dead cells, cellular debris, large chunks of food, any sort of molecules or cells lying around in the body needs broken down. There are primary phagocytic cells. The microglia are the phagocytes of the brain. They do the macrophage job for the brain, maintaining brain tissue, cleaning up dead cellular debris from neuroglia, killing any bacteria that manage to get in. And finally, in terms of our neuroglia in the CNS, we have ependymal cells, E-P-E-N-D-Y-M-A-L. Ependymal cells are responsible for secreting a fluid that you might have heard of called cerebrospinal fluid, C-E-R-E cerebrospinal. Cerebro having to do with the brain, spinal having to do with the spinal cord. Cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF for short, is going to be the fluid basis of the protection of the brain and the spinal cord. The brain and the spinal cord are surrounded by a cushion of cerebrospinal fluid. It constantly circulates around the brain and down the spinal column and back up and gets reabsorbed by the body. Cerebrospinal fluid has a couple of functions. It rinses away wastes from the brain and the spinal cord. It helps to circulate oxygen more effectively in the central nervous system because blood doesn't get in as well. It helps also to be a chemical regulator, balancing out pH changes and concentrations of electrolytes. And finally, it acts as a shock absorber, a liquid cushion protecting the brain and the spinal cord from harm. It basically prevents the brain and spinal cord from bouncing off the inside of the vertebral column and the skull in the instance of jostling or injury. Whenever your brain does hit against the inside of the skull, when there's a big impact that can't stop that, that's when you get a concussion. But cerebrospinal fluid stops most minor impacts. Your brain literally floats inside of your cranium in a cushion of cerebrospinal fluid that prevents the heavy parts on the top of the brain from crushing the parts on the bottom of the brain against the inside of the skull. Your brain is a couple of kilograms, but because of its buoyancy, it behaves as if it only weighed about 50 grams. All right, so that is going to be our neuroglia, the rest of the cells of our brain. Now, to close out this section, folks, I would like to talk to you a little bit about the central nervous system as it is organized in vertebrates and the peripheral nervous system as it is organized in vertebrates, because vertebrates are the most complex living animals anatomically, and they have the most highly developed nervous systems. Ergo, I want to say a few special words about them. Now, in vertebrates, we're going to find a high degree of cephalization, a large concentration of complex and well-organized matter located inside the animal's skull, in the cranium of the skull, cranium. The cranium, that we often use that word synonymously with skull, it's not the complete skull. The cranium is the part of the skull that surrounds and encloses the brain. The cranium serves to protect the brain, just as the vertebral column, the vertebrae, or spine as we know it, serves to protect the spinal cord. The brain and the spinal cord are directly connected. They are in direct continuous joining with each other. Really, the spinal cord is just a posterior extension of the brainstem down into the spine. Pardon me. As a vertebrate, you have one brain, and you have a single nerve cord running down the length of the body. Actually, one of the distinctive features of being a member of the phylum Chordata, that is the phylum that vertebrates belong to, subphylum Vertebrata, is that a chordate, C-H-O-R-D-A-T-E, that chordates have a dorsal hollow nerve cord. What that means is that we have one nerve cord running away from the brain. It is dorsal, meaning it's down the back of the body. A lot of insects have a ventral one. It is hollow, meaning that there's actually a space inside of your spinal cord during its development that's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. In most people, that space fuses shut by the time you're born. And that nerve cord runs down the back length of the body, extending from the brain all the way down to the base of the vertebral column. Actually, your vertebral column outgrows your spinal cord. So whenever you're a baby, it's all the way down your spinal column. By the time you reach adulthood, it actually terminates right around the third lumbar vertebra in the back. First to third round, depending on the individual. But you have a number of layers of protective tissue that surround the brain and spinal cord in vertebrates. They call those the meninges, meninges, meninges. Sorry, spelling bee in my head here. The meninges are the protective layers of tissue that surround and protect the brain and the spinal cord. You have three of them layered one on top of the other. The outermost is the dura mater, D-U-R-A, mater, M-A-T-E-R, literally translates as tough mother. Deep to that is the arachnoid mater, A-R-A-C-H-N-O-I-D. Means spidery mother, it's got a web-like appearance. And then directly against the surface of the brain and spinal cord, you find the pia mater, P-I-A, which means delicate mother. It's very clear and transparent and very thin. Those layers protect the brain and spinal cord from a lot of outside harm if they become inflamed or infected. That is a condition you've probably heard of called meningitis. Now, in the vertebrate nervous system, you're going to find that you have a division of labor, that the spinal cord actually takes care of a lot of reflex actions, things like urination, knee-jerk reflexes, like, when you touch a hot object and your hand jerks back real fast. Your spinal cord handles that reflex arc. The brain is not involved. So there are a lot of basic things that the spinal cord actually processes and handles for you as a vertebrate. You will find that there are a lot of open spaces in vertebral nervous systems. You're going to have a number of cavities within your brain called ventricles, V-E-N-T-R-I-C-L-E-S. The ventricles are filled with cerebrospinal fluid, which circulates through the interior of the brain to rinse away wastes and circulate nutrients. We've already established that the brain and spinal cord in vertebrates contain both gray matter and white matter. The gray matter is the unmyelinated tissue. It's the association regions that communicate with one another in order to produce and transmit signals and put together data. The white matter is the myelinated portions of your central nervous system. That is bundled into tracts, T-R-A-C-T, which are bundles of nerve fibers which connect specific parts of the brain and the spinal cord to one another. And that allows communication between specific regions for correlating data and making decisions. Now, the vertebrate brain is a rather remarkable structure. It's probably the most amazing feature of our bodies, and it's really the only thing about Homo sapiens that makes us really distinct from other animals, is the complexity and level of development of our brains. Incidentally, fun story about that. The reason you have such a complex brain is because you walk upright. Upright walking came before complex brain development in our ancestors. Think about your average quadruped. Think about your dog, think about your cat. Their neck's kind of connected to the back of their head, more or less, right? And you'll find that the hole in their skull that the spinal cord comes out from, the foramen magnum, it's called, F-O-R-A-M-E-N, magnum, M-A-G-N-U-M, literally translates as big hole. But the foramen magnum is usually oriented in the rear of the skull or kind of tilted towards the base and rear in your average quadruped. A quadruped has its head sticking forward on the body, right? That's the head is out in front of the body when the animal is walking. Well, one of the things that means is that the quadruped has a limit on how heavy its brain can get because you need to support the weight of that brain with a head that is unsupported from below. And therefore, my quadruped needs to have strong neck muscles in order to support its head, and there's a mechanical limit on how large that skull can get, how big that brain can get, not only because of the gravitational and mechanical forces involved in holding it, but also because of the muscle attachments that have to anchor on the skull in order to support it. You can only make those so big depending on the size of the animal. So you'll find that most quadrupeds have an inherent limit on how big of a brain they can get relative to their body size. Remember, absolute brain size is not the determinant of intelligence. It is cephalic index, as we mentioned in an earlier lesson, the ratio of brain size to body size, of which we have the highest cephalic index of any living animal. Now, you, however, have an interesting thing going on. When your ancestors came down out of the trees 6 to 7 million years ago, the beginnings of family Hominidae basically involved bipedalism, upright walking on your hind legs. It happened in a period of African history whenever the climate was cooling and the forests were thinning out. It was easier to go across wide open terrain on 2 legs than in 4. It was more mechanically efficient. You could maintain the stride for longer. Homo sapiens are amazing at endurance. We are actually super effective endurance hunters because, yeah, most of the animals we hunt for food are faster than us, but unlike them, you can go for longer. They get tired out more rapidly, and as a result, we can just keep after them, running them down until they get exhausted after we injure them. But anyhow, though, upright walking made it more efficient to move out across the open grasslands, a more effective way to get from point A to point B when you're moving between trees, looking for food and places to live. It also meant that you had less of your body surface exposed to the sun, that you had the top of your head and your shoulders are basically the parts that have sun exposure, which meant less likelihood of sunburn whenever you're walking on the open fields, as opposed to a horizontal animal where the back would be all exposed. It is not a coincidence that the place we mainly still have hair is on top of our heads. And it meant that whenever we moved out across the open space, we had our front paws free. They weren't involved in walking, and therefore we could use our front paws for manipulation purposes. We could use them to pick up an infant and carry it to safety. We could use them to grab a chunk of food and carry it with us wherever we went. We could grab a useful object, a sharp stick or a sharp rock that we could use as a tool. And therefore, upright walking ended up working out well for us at an evolutionary level. But another thing that upright walking meant is that it changed the orientation of the head, balancing the head vertically on top of the neck. Mechanically speaking, that is a much more efficient way to balance your weight. And as a result, balancing the head vertically meant that you need less muscle attachments to support the weight of the head. Most of it's coming from below, and therefore you can expand the brain case. And our ancestors living out on the plains, slow moving compared to most predators, not possessed of claws or fangs, adapted to that dangerous environment primarily by expanding their brains, developing an elaborate nervous system to process data and to think of ways around the complexities of the environment. So you'll find that the general trend in human evolution is that from bipedalism on, selection strongly favors a larger and larger brain case till we get to the big brain that you're walking around with now. Trade-off evolutionarily for that, by the way, is the same time we're enlarging the head, we are also narrowing the hips to bring the legs pulled underneath our bodies for efficient upright locomotion. And the effect of that is narrowing the birth canal, which means we have to fit a much bigger head through a much narrower passage when we give birth. As a consequence, Homo sapiens has the most complicated birthing process of any mammal. It is way harder for you to give birth than for a cat to give birth. And another consequence of that is that natural selection strongly favored cooperation in behavior to facilitate childbirth. And therefore, natural selection favored cooperative behavior in our kind because it made it more likely that we would successfully give birth if you had somebody helping you from the outside with all the complications involved and protecting you during the very dangerous process. So we find the evolution of the big brain and cooperative behavior happening side by side, partly as a way of compensating for the evolutionary cost of the big head, which aside from the energy cost of maintaining it, is also the narrow birth canal that makes birthing a lot more difficult. Now looking at that brain, the brain varies a lot from one species to another. Primarily, however, the variation is in the size of its regions and the complexity of its parts. That the overall architecture of the brain is pretty much the same in every vertebrate, the kinds of parts that it has and how they are organized. The main differences are in the relative size of different brain regions, which makes certain animals better or worse at certain things. For example, as I pointed out in our last lesson, your dog has way larger olfactory bulbs, scent processing centers of the brain, than you do. You, on the other hand, have a much larger center of the brain than the dog does for processing emotional and cooperative data. You're a much more empathic animal than your dog with a more complex range of emotional responses. Dogs can be empathic, I'm not saying they can't, but again, sliding scale like most of these things. You'll also find the other thing that tends to vary is the surface area of the brain. Human brain, as you all know, is highly wrinkly, right? Lots of folds and creases in its surface. Those thick folds are called gyri, G-Y-R-I, or singular gyrus, G-Y-R-U-S. The grooves between them are called sulci, S-U-L-C-I, or singular sulcus, S-U-L-C-U-S. Having a densely folded brain like that gives you more effective surface area for processing data. Your brain has 3 times the surface area that it would have if it was perfectly smooth because of all that folding. Not all animals have as folded a brain as you do. And in general, if you're looking at an animal that's relatively intelligent compared to its body size, you're going to find it has more folds and crenellations in its brain. A cat's brain is smaller than that of a sheep, but the cat's brain has a lot more folding in it, and therefore more surface area, more processing space, kind of like adding hard drive space to a computer. Or more to the point of adding operating memory to a computer is a better way of thinking of it. So a lot of the variation we see in vertebrate brains is not in the parts that they have, but in the size of different regions and the amount of surface folding that we find in the cortex, the outermost layer of the brain, where most of the cognitive activity happens. The further back in the brain you go, the less variation there is between organisms. The general rule is that the hindbrain is the most primitive region of the brain, evolutionarily speaking. It's the region that has the oldest and most basic structures, and that the further forward you get in the brain, the more variation you see between species as they've diverged in different ways. By the way, brain directional terminology that you will hear sometimes. If I'm talking about something that's towards the back of the brain, I will say it is in the caudal direction, C-A-U-D-A-L. Whereas if I talk about something towards the front of the brain, I will say it is in the rostral direction, R-O-S-T-R-A-L. Those words mean caudal towards the tail, rostral towards the snout. And the reason for that is because some of the first studies of brain anatomy were done on rats. And when you're dissecting a rat, towards the tail and towards the snout are the right directions when you're looking at the parts of its brain. So we have three basic brain regions, each of which has a number of subdivisions. The basic regions of our brain, which you might already know this, are called the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. F-O-R-E-B-R-A-I-N for forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain. I think you can see how those would be spelled. That's all one word for each of those things. Midbrain is all one word. Now, starting from the posterior end, starting from the most primitive region of the brain, let's talk about the hindbrain. The hindbrain is the most similar across species. Hindbrain is going to be handling a lot of the background functions of life. It is sometimes called the brain stem. Your hindbrain has a number of subdivisions. It has the medulla oblongata, medulla, M-E-D-U-L-L-A, oblongata, O-B-L-O-N-G-A-T-A, medulla oblongata. We sometimes call it the medulla for short, but there are lots of parts of the body that are called medullae, so that's a little bit misleading. But anyhow, though, the medulla oblongata is sometimes called the brainstem proper, although the hindbrain as a whole is often called the brainstem. Medulla oblongata is a little stalk of tissue at the base of your brain. It's directly continuous with the spinal cord. Kind of it looks like a thicker version of the spinal cord reaching up into the head. Medulla oblongata handles a lot of the very basic reflex activities of life, the fundamental background stuff that keeps you running. Medulla oblongata, among other things, controls breathing, pulse, blood pressure, and a lot of basic reflex actions like coughing, sneezing, swallowing, salivation, the gagging reflex, sweating, secretions of your GI tract. A lot of that housekeeping stuff that your body does in the background without you having to think about it. Injury to the medulla oblongata will usually kill you because it's handling the stuff that keeps you alive moment to moment. A little bit rostral to the medulla oblongata, you go a little higher up in the brain, you'll find a little forward bulge just above the brainstem that we call the pons, P-O-N-S. That is not a plural, the S is part of the word. The pons is going to have a number of functions related to those of the medulla oblongata. It has a role in the regulation of breathing. It's involved in eye movements. It's involved in facial sensation and expression. It helps with certain aspects of bladder control and posture, and it helps with some of the muscles involved in swallowing. So there's some overlap with the functions of the medulla oblongata. Now at the very back of the brain, you'll find a little lump of tissue, a little kind of mini brain it almost looks like, called the cerebellum. C-E-R-E-B-E-L-L-U-M, literally translates as little brain. The cerebellum only occupies about 10% of your brain's mass, but it contains 50% of its neurons. It is very densely packed with neurons, like the front regions of the brain. It's deeply folded and creased. The cerebellum is responsible for the coordination of movements. Lots of different processing involved in proprioception. Remember that sense of where your body parts are? The cerebellum keeps track of that and also keeps track of how they're moving relative to each other. It is your cerebellum that helps you put one foot in front of the other when you're walking and move your hand to intercept a ball when you catch. We also believe that the cerebellum has some role in our sense of awareness of our environment and our judgment of the passage of time. We're still learning about some of its functions, but coordination of movement seems to be the most important. And finally, the most rostral part of the brainstem is going to be the diencephalon, D-I-E-N-C-E-P-H-A-L-O-N. The diencephalon is kind of at almost the middle of the brain. It's not the midbrain as such, but it's, located largely near the center. It's got two major parts. We have the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The thalamus, T-H-A-L-A-M-U-S, one of those things that anatomy texts like to say. There are certain things you say in science that everybody hears, like, oh, the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Everybody knows that phrase. The one about the thalamus is we call the thalamus the gateway to the cerebral cortex. Basically, the thalamus takes the sensory data collected by nerves throughout the body and relays them to the parts of the brain that need to handle them. So it's a sensory relay center. Beneath it is the hypothalamus, H-Y-P-O thalamus. Hypo literally means below. The hypothalamus is a very important region of the brain because it's coordinating most of your body's unconscious activities. Hypothalamus is responsible for a wide range of things: the digestion of food, the production of sex hormones and the reproductive process. It's responsible for coordinating your endocrine system. It controls most endocrine hormones in the body. Attached directly to the hypothalamus is a little gland called the pituitary gland, P-I-T-U-I-T-A-R-Y. The pituitary gland is sometimes called the master gland of the body because it controls most of the other glands. It makes like 9 different hormones, which tell other glands, for the most part, what they need to be doing. Hypothalamus also manages a lot of basic background chemical activities like water conservation and controlling your levels of electrolytes. It handles labor contractions and lactation in pregnant women. It's responsible for your circadian rhythms, your attunement to the day-night cycle. And it's responsible for a lot of what we call the primitive emotions: pleasure, contentment, anger, fear, lust, aggression. All the stuff that sends you to the dark side in Star Wars, is handled by the hypothalamus. And on the very top of the thalamus, I should point out, there's an odd little structure called the epithalamus, E-P-I thalamus. The epithalamus is where you find the pineal gland, P-I-N-E-A-L. That's a little tiny pine cone-shaped gland, part of the endocrine system. We don't really know what the pineal gland is for, but we think it's involved in regulating our circadian rhythms. It produces the hormones melatonin and serotonin. And melatonin, you probably know, is regulating our sleep cycle. Serotonin, of course, is a mood regulator. So we think issues with the pineal gland might be involved in certain forms of clinical depression, but because it's so deep inside the brain, it is super hard to study. All right, so that is going to be our brainstem, or our hindbrain. Now, a little bit rostral to that, a little bit further forward, we find the midbrain. And the midbrain is a loose collection of gray matter and white matter bundles doing a bunch of different functions. The midbrain has several different activities that it handles. There's a core of gray matter that connects the midbrain and the hindbrain. We call it the reticular formation, R-E-T-I-C-U-L-A-R. And it binds the two together, and there's a lot of overlap in what they do. Some of the functions of the midbrain: we have an area called the central gray matter, which handles our pain awareness and our response to pain. We have an area called the substantia nigra, S-U-B-S-T-A-N-T-I-A, substantia nigra, N-I-G-R-A, spelled N-E-G-R-A in some texts. Substantia nigra is a muscular inhibitor. It prevents the muscles from moving too much in response to minor stimuli. Breakdown in the substantia nigra can cause uncontrolled muscular movements, and it's associated with what we call Parkinson's disease. There's also a region of the midbrain called the tectum. The tectum is responsible for visual and auditory tracking, meaning our ability to follow things with our eyes and our ears. The tectum allows you to glance at an object that's moving and follow its movements. It also allows you to hear a noise and track where the object is moving by listening to where that noise is going to go. There are a few other regions of the midbrain, but those are the really important ones. Now, of course, the super action region of the brain, the region that you are most concerned with, you hear the most about because it's the one that you're using right now. And that would be the cerebrum or forebrain. Forebrain is the largest mass of the brain. About 83% of the brain's mass is forebrain. Most of that is the cerebrum, C-E-R-E-B-R-U-M. The cerebrum is the thinking part of the brain. It's the part of the brain that does all the cognitive processing, the neurological activity that we associate with cognition. It allows us to engage in planning, judgments, memory, decision-making, learning, speech processing, hand-eye coordination, all of the different muscle memory actions that we learn. All this learned and consciously processed knowledge is handled by the cerebrum. The cerebrum is where conscious thought happens. It's where your internal narrative happens when you're thinking inside of your head. The cerebrum is where you plan things. It is where all of your awareness of the world around you is processed. Cerebral cortex is the outermost layer of the cerebrum. I think I've used that term in here already. It's a thin layer of gray matter found on the outside of the cerebrum. It's only a few millimeters thick, but most of your thinking happens in there. Most of the rest of the cerebrum is white matter connecting one region to another, and little chunks of gray matter deeper inside called the nuclei. The forebrain also contains centers involved in emotional processing and regulation. There's a structure called the amygdala, A-M-Y-G-D-L-A, great spelling there. A-M-Y-G-D-A-L-A, amygdala. The amygdala is our primary emotional processing center. It's believed that in people who are sociopathic or psychopathic, the amygdala is deficient in its activities. And then we have the hippocampus, H-I-P-P-O-C-A-M-P-U-S. The hippocampus is a forebrain structure that converts short-term memory into long-term memory, allowing us to take the experiences that you have learned during your day-to-day life and convert them into long memories that your body stores and can access later. We believe that most of that happens while you're asleep, in fact. In fact, it's thought that the main reason why vertebrates need sleep is because that's when their brain does memory consolidation, sorts through all the memories, discards some of them, decides which ones are important, and files them properly. We believe that dreaming is what happens while your brain is doing that, which is why your dreams often contain sort of disconnected or fantastical images or bring up things you haven't thought about in your while as your brain is trying to make connections between new knowledge and old knowledge. You might be aware that the cerebrum is divided into several distinct regions. First off, left versus right. You've probably heard of left brain versus right brain. We have a left cerebrum and a right cerebrum, the two hemispheres, H-E-M-I-S-P-H-E-R-E, hemispheres. They are basically independent of each other. For the most part, the two halves of the brain operate as independent systems. They're joined together by a little band of white matter called the corpus callosum. Corpus, C-O-R-P-U-S, callosum, C-A-L-L-O-S-U-M. Corpus callosum connects left brain and right brain and allows them to exchange information. You don't need it. You can live without it. In fact, at one time, they used to cut the corpus callosum as a possible solution to epileptic seizures, as a way of stopping seizures that could not be stopped any other way. It seems to help for reasons we're not clear on, but it causes you some problems because when the left brain and right brain can't communicate, certain knowledge becomes harder to coordinate. You might be aware that the left side of your body is controlled by the right half of your brain and vice versa. We call it contralateral control. So when you have a stroke on the right side of your brain, the paralytic problems happen on the left side of your body and vice versa. So if you have no connection between those two, hand-eye coordination becomes a lot harder because the left side of your brain literally does not know what the right side of your brain is doing, and therefore it becomes difficult to coordinate both hands to do things at once. Also, if you cover one eye, that means only one half of the brain is getting the visual input. I cover my right eye, only my left eye is exposed, so the right brain gets the visual input contralaterally. Likewise, cover my left eye, my right eye is exposed, sends data to the left half of the brain. This has been cool for studying what parts of the brain do what things, because in people who have that severed, we can do tests with them where we'll, hey, okay, cover this eye. Cover your right eye, have that person look at a chair. Ask them what they're looking at. They will not be able to name the object. They'll say, oh yeah, I have one of those at home. I sit on it. It's made of wood. It's got 4 legs, but they will not be able to tell you the word chair. Cover the other eye, have them look at the exact same object. They will say, oh yeah, that's a chair. But they will not be able to tell you what it's for. Expose both eyes, now they can do that thing. So, interesting thing we see about lateralization of activity. You've probably heard about left brain versus right brain people, that left brain people are, more artistic and intuitive. Right brain people are more logical and mathematical. That's bullshit. It's not actually how things work. Nearly every activity you do involves left and right brain doing stuff together. But there do seem to be certain kinds of cognition that are better processed in certain regions of the brain, as I have just demonstrated. Now, we also divide up the 2 hemispheres into lobes, L-O-B-E-S. Each hemisphere of the brain is divided into 5 distinct lobes. We have the frontal lobe, located at the front of the brain. The frontal lobe in humans is more highly developed than in any other vertebrates, because the frontal lobe is where most of the higher thinking happens. This is where judgments, pre-planning, ability to think ahead, awareness of your environment, awareness of proper conduct of behavior, all that sort of thing is handled by the frontal lobe. Injuries to the frontal lobe of the brain can result in severe cognitive impairments, inability to judge appropriate behavior, emotional outbursts that the body cannot regulate, that sort of thing. Go a little bit further back. Right here, sides of your head. That is the parietal lobe, P-A-R-I-E-T-A-L. Parietal lobe is mostly involved in sensory processing of hearing, sense, I was actually hearing and not sense. It's kind of funny because memory is the thing that happens in a different region of the brain, and my brain is locking up. But your sense of hearing is handled in the parietal lobe. A lot of your movements are coordinated in the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe contains the primary motor cortex. That is the part of the brain that decides about your conscious body movements. So that's going to be involved there. Parietal lobe does somesthetic data. The word somesthetic, S-O-M-E-S-T-H-E-T-I-C. Somesthetic basically means all the collective senses that we call the sense of touch from throughout the body. That's processed by the parietal lobe. So is your sense of taste. Took me a minute to dig up that data. Back of your brain, the occipital lobe. O-C-C-I-P-I-T-A-L. The occipital lobe is the primary visual center. That's the almost entire job of the occipital lobe, processes visual data. You get bonked in the back of the head, your vision gets blurry, right? Because you disrupted visual signaling. Sides of the head right here, by your temples, we find the temporal lobe, T-E-M-P-O-R-A-L. The temporal lobe is involved in hearing and equilibrium. It's involved in your sense of smell, and it's also heavily involved in learning and memory. A lot of our memory stuff happens processed in the temporal lobe. Incidentally, because the sense of smell is processed there and the lobe is involved in memory, we actually form stronger associations with scent than with any of our other senses. Your sense of smell is actually your weakest of your major senses. We have what we call the special senses, vision, hearing, equilibrium, smell, and taste, all of which are localized in the head. All of your other senses are general senses or somesthetic senses. They're the ones scattered throughout the body, which are, again, chemical senses and things we collectively call touch. But of all of your special senses, your sense of smell is the weakest one, but it forms the strongest and most powerful memories because it's processed in the same region of the brain that handles learning and memory. You all know that you can smell a thing and it instantly takes you back to Christmas mornings, the smell of the candles that your family burned on the mantle at Christmas, or there's the smell of the cabin in the woods where you used to go camping when you were a kid or whatever, and you know that smell immediately. Long after you have forgotten what Grandma's voice sounded like, you will remember what Grandma's house smelled like. And the deepest lobe of the brain, it's actually not even listed on a lot of discussions of the lobes of the brain, is called the insula. insula. It's kind of behind the temporal lobe. We don't know a lot about what it does because of its location deep in the brain. It's hard to study, but we believe the insula is involved in linguistic processing and helping to learn language. All right. So that is the forebrain, the most complex cognitive region of the brain, and it's where most of the things we think of as thinking happen. So it's perhaps no surprise that it's better developed in you than in any other living animal. Now, let's move out of the central nervous system and talk a little bit about the peripheral nervous system, which is not as complex. The peripheral nervous system contains nerves and ganglia. Nerves, of course, you know, are like bundles of individual nerve fibers or axons. Ganglia are clusters of neuron cell bodies scattered throughout the body as relay points. You have two kinds of nerves, cranial nerves and spinal nerves. Cranial nerves come directly from the brain, and all mammals have 12 pairs of them, 12 on each side. We number them 1 through 12 from most rostral to most caudal. But that's a universal feature across the kingdom Mammalia. You have 12 cranial nerves. Then there are spinal nerves. Spinal nerves originate from the spinal cord, and all mammals have 31 pairs of those. It's all the same for all of us. Ganglia are scattered throughout the body in a number of different locations. They're highly variable. Now, the best way to talk about the peripheral nervous system is in terms of function rather than structure, because the same nerves are used for different functions. A nerve that carries data to the brain might also carry a signal back from it. There are some dedicated sensory nerves and some dedicated motor nerves, but a lot of them are two-way paths. We can divide up the peripheral nervous system, therefore, by function better than by structure. There are two broad functional divisions of the peripheral nervous system, the sensory division and the motor division. Sensory is afferent, bringing data into the central nervous system. Motor is efferent, sending instructions out from the central nervous system. Sensory division can be divided into somatic sensory and visceral sensory. Somatic sensory division, S-O-M-A-T-I-C, the word somatic means pertaining to the body. Somatic sensory information comes from your skin, your bones, your muscles, your joints, and your external sensory receptors. That's all somatic sensory data. It is the data you're most likely to be consciously aware of. Visceral sensory data, remember that word visceral, V-I-S-C-E-R-A-L, means pertaining to internal organs, or viscera. Visceral sensory data is sensory data from inside the body. Some of that you're aware of, like when your stomach hurts, or when your lungs are burning after you breathe super hard during the workouts, or when your stomach is full, or your bladder is full. That is visceral sensory data that causes a conscious sensation. A lot of visceral sensory data you don't know about. You don't feel a change in your body when your blood pressure rises. You don't feel a change when the pH of your bodily fluids goes down. That's all data your brain is collecting. That is visceral sensory data, but it's handled entirely by the back brain, by the hindbrain, and therefore you have no cognitive sensation that tells you about it. So a lot of visceral sensory data is unconscious. Now we have the motor division. The motor division also has a somatic motor division and a visceral motor division. Somatic motor division is responsible for all of your conscious movements, your choices to move your arms or to turn your head or to move your tongue and lips to talk or to hold your breath. All the things you choose to do are somatic motor actions. Also handles unconscious muscular reflexes. So like whenever you get your knee tapped by the doctor with that little hammer and your leg kicks, that little reflex action, that's a somatic motor response. Jerking your hand back from something painful, that's a somatic motor reflex. Then there is the visceral motor division. The visceral motor division has another name. It is called the autonomic nervous system. A-U-T-O-N-O-M-I-C. Autonomic. The autonomic nervous system, or ANS, is the busiest part of your nervous system. It is the most active division of the nervous system, because the autonomic nervous system is handling all the background activities of the body. Autonomic nervous system handles breathing, sweating, heartbeats, blood pressure, digestion, urination, production of sex cells. all the many, many background activities that your body does without you having to think about it or even being able to think about it. You cannot consciously choose, okay, I'm going to grow more skin. You cannot consciously say, all right, I'm going to increase my blood pressure right now. You can't make those things happen. But your autonomic nervous system regulates all of that, and you have no conscious awareness of most of it. There are some limited cases in which the cerebrum can override the autonomic nervous system. For example, you can choose to hold your breath. You can choose to delay urination until convenient moments. But for the most part, the autonomic nervous system handles those background activities without you having to do anything about it. So it is far and away the busiest part of your nervous system. It's doing all the housekeeping in the body that you are not consciously aware of, but is necessary to maintain you and keep you functioning. Autonomic nervous system, or visceral motor division, can be divided up further into two distinct branches of response. We can talk about the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic divisions. The sympathetic division, S-Y-M-P-A-T-H-E-T-I-C, the sympathetic division is sometimes called the fight or flight division. It stirs the body to action. Sympathetic division increases your heart rate, increases your breathing, directs more blood flow towards your muscles, increases your awareness. The sympathetic division is getting you ready for action, fight or flight. Okay, I'm ready to fight or I'm ready to flee, to run away. So the sympathetic division ramps up the body for activity. Favorite joke that is included in anatomy textbooks all over the world is that the sympathetic division handles the 4 F's. It prepares the body for feeding, for fleeing, for fighting, and for mating. Take a minute, I'm sure you'll get it. Now, the other half of this is the parasympathetic division. P-A-R-A, sympathetic. The parasympathetic division, if sympathetic is fight or flight, parasympathetic could be called rest and digest. Parasympathetic slows things down, cools the body off, lowers your heart rate, slows your breathing, calms the body down, gets you ready for rest, relaxes things. Sympathetic division also handles a lot of the upkeep that the body does in the background, things like healing of injuries and processing of nutrients, things that happen when your body is at a state of rest. I should point out there's one big exception to the sympathetic versus parasympathetic division of labor, where sympathetic stimulates things, parasympathetic calms them down. The big exception is digestion. Sympathetic division slows down digestion while it's speeding up everything else. Parasympathetic division ramps up digestion while everything else is calming. And the reason for that is quite simple. Your body only has so many resources to allocate. So much energy, so much oxygen, only so much blood. 75% of your blood vessels are empty at any given time. So our bodies route the resources where they're most needed. And when you're involved in a sympathetic response and you're concerned with fighting the bear or running away from danger or whatever you have to do, the last thing your body needs to be doing is devoting resources to digesting a meal that's not going to be processed for several hours. Ergo, blood flow goes away from your digestive tract and towards your muscles and your brain to manage the immediate needs. So that's why they always tell you don't exercise real hard after a big meal, because your body at that moment is trying to digest. Likewise, when everything else is slowing down, you know how you eat that real big meal on Thanksgiving and afterwards you feel all heavy and you feel like you just want to lie back and not move and your arms and legs feel all heavy? That's because they're getting less blood flow, because that blood is being routed to your digestive tract to help you process that big meal. Because when everything else is slowing down, digestion is ramping up. Your body has the resources to spare for the energy-intensive activity of breaking down your food. So that's our big exception to the sympathetic-parasympathetic rule of stimulus and relaxation. That fight or flight response is one of the most basic animal responses, by the way, folks. All animals do a version of that. The adrenaline hormones that stimulate it are all but universal in the animal kingdom. Basically, they prep an animal to respond to danger. They get the animal's system ramped up and sending resources to where it is most necessary. So that sympathetic-parasympathetic division affects everything with a central nervous system, not just vertebrates, and it's a very fundamental adaptive response for every animal in dealing with the dangers posed by its environment. I should point out that we can stimulate that even when we're not actually in danger. You watch a horror movie, your brain acts as if you're in danger. That's why your heart rate picks up. Go on a roller coaster, same deal. Get super stressed by your environment. Stress responses are sympathetic responses because our environments are full of things that worry us that our ancestors did not evolve having to worry about. In their evolution, stressful things meant, okay, there's a bear coming out of the woods, or here's a guy trying to kill me with a stick. That was the stress. Now our world is full of all kinds of other stresses. Oh crap, I have to get my project done on time. Oh crap, I have to make it in time for my date. Oh crap, I have to get all my errands done before I can go home. The thing is, our brain only has one toolkit for dealing with stress, and therefore it ramps up a sympathetic response, which is why when you're stressed, your heart beats harder and your blood pressure goes up and you feel agitated, because your body is basically getting ready for action, even if the stress is, I have to type this paper right now. Okay, folks, so that is actually going to wrap up our look at animal nervous systems. If you had an anatomy and physiology class, a lot of what I just said to you is probably review. Because really, the things I just said about how nervous systems work that function in humans function pretty much the same way in every member of the animal kingdom. The nervous system is really one of the systems that shows the least variation in basic function from one animal species to another. If you've got a central nervous system, it pretty much works the way I have just described. All right, but that ties off this particular chapter and this particular lesson. Thank you for your attention. Hope you all have a great day. Talk to you soon.